All right, we are back on It's All Interesting. And today I have with me once again David Stradamus, Nostradamus, David D. Chapman, host of The Chapman Show. Folks, you heard it here on this program about a month ago. I asked David his prediction. He said 312. He might have said something somewhere else, but on this show, he said 312. David, how'd you get it right?
Well, I know even if it was a tie race at the polls, that Trump always outperforms the polls, and so I had Trump winning the popular vote. I also 4 years ago was telling everybody that he was going to be the front runner for the nomination and win because I was doing this whole historical analysis thing with Grover Cleveland because I did a deep dive into why I missed on my historical model in 2020. But that's a long story for a much longer show. But that's ultimately how I got to where I was, is that I was just banking on my historical trends to be right. And so if you really want to talk about Nostradamus, I called this 4 years ago. So
Well, let me ask you just to stay on the historical side just a little, because maybe we could do a whole another show on that. But what were the trends like during Grover Cleveland's reelection for his second non-consecutive term?
okay, so a decade leading up to Grover Cleveland's presidency, there was a recession that was the worst until the Great Depression. A decade leading up to Donald Trump's presidency in 2016, we had the Great Recession, the worst since the Great Depression. So you had two recessions leading up to these two men's presidencies that were arguably the second and the third worst behind the Great Depression era. That put people in the worst financial situation, made them rethink their economic priorities, made them rethink everything. With Grover Cleveland, he won Republican states because he was a Democrat. So he won Republican states that had never been won by a Democrat in the post Civil War era. And he stole away the Republican hardcore base called the Mugwumps, an activist group, which, much like Trump did, he flipped the working class. Um, and then in 2020 and in 1888 he got thrown out of office because everybody in the establishment is, oh, he's creating chaos, when actually he was creating change. And then they wanted everyone to believe he was creating chaos, so then they would get sick of him, much like what we saw with Trump. And so there was they were caught red-handed. The Republicans were in Indiana and New York with fraud, but no one cared. The votes were certified. Benjamin Harrison became president, and then everybody 4 years later, Harrison, terrible president, terrible economy,
Hmm.
terrible inflation, currency problems, war
And this was
problems,
all
and
this
next
was
thing,
all concurrent with the Gilded Age era, correct? Where the
yes,
the
and
the
so next
enormous discrepancy between the wealth gap in this country.
Yes, and next thing you know, Grover Cleveland storms back, wins the nomination very easily for the Democrats, whereas Benjamin Harrison struggled to win the Republican nomination, much like Biden. He couldn't even hang on to
Hmm.
it. Um, and so you can see where I'm going with this. And that Trump had the same problems, got thrown out of office, and then the trajectory remained the
Hmm.
same as that he returned. The greatest comeback in political history with Donald Trump.
Better than Grover
So
Cleveland, you think?
Oh, almost certainly, because this was the only time it's ever happened in the primary era.
Hmm.
Grover Cleveland was nominated by a bunch of old white guys in a smoke-filled
Hmm.
room, whereas Donald Trump had to fight his way through a primary. Um,
All right.
so
Well, hopefully one day we can do a full deep dive into the Grover Cleveland presidency and second term. All right. So, David, you mentioned good segue from Grover Cleveland. Where what how wrong would you say the polls were? Because I think looking at the polls this time versus 2016 and 2020, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like one, there were some pollsters such as Atlas and Trafalgar that were pretty close to where the race ended up. That's number one. And then number two, the misses did not seem as missed as in 2020. Am I right with that?
well, They didn't overstate. Well, I think they actually overstated Trump's vote share by exactly 2 points. He didn't get the average 2.7 overstate. He only got two. Um, but the polls, in terms of the delta or the margin of lead that they had in RCP, was Harris point 0.1, and it's right now Trump plus 2.6. So it's an average of 2.7, which is typically what it was. Um, and you had polls like Merin plus 4. You have a lot of blue in there. That anybody that had Harris leading by 2 or more was off by a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there are a lot of polls in there that were +2 Harris, +2 Harris, +3 Harris. Even a +1 Harris, you could argue, it's not a bad poll. It's within a margin of error, but they were likely hedging because this race was never close. Sure, it was only a +2.5 point national victory. But you go and look at the Pennsylvania lead that he had in the RCP average, it was 0.5.
Yeah, and
He won it by 2.5.
right, and you had some New York Times polling that came out in the last couple of weeks of the campaign that showed Harris up 5-6 in Michigan, up 4-5 in Pennsylvania. There were some outliers. Now, I don't think we saw an outlier like we did see with the Biden plus 18 in Wisconsin, except the Seltzer plus 3 for Harris in Iowa, which, to be fair, she was only 14 points off.
I mean, Donald Trump became the first president since Ronald Reagan to win Ohio, Iowa, and Florida all by double digits in an election. He's only one of 6 Republicans to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin twice. If you add Florida, Ohio, Iowa, and Georgia all in there, so those 7 states, which Republican has won those 7 states twice? It's just Donald Trump.
Where do you think this has polls going forward? This is Donald Trump's last election. So going forward, and as we saw, Nate Cohn at the New York Times said that there was an undercounting, there was an inability to get Republicans to answer polls, something like 16% as compared to Democrats. Trump's not going to be on the ballot anymore. Do you think that will reshape polling, or is this still going to be a problem going forward?
It will, because it's not undersampling Trump. It's underestimating turnout, like we've talked about before. It's that white working class voter that pollsters have always had a problem surveying, whether they're supporting Democrats or Republicans. And if in 2028, say J.D. Vance is on the ticket, and the white working class is supporting him because right now they're supporting Republicans, they could easily underestimate Vance because they'll underestimate the white working class, right? They overestimated Romney in 2012 because they thought another 3 million white voters were going to come out to vote when they didn't. And they underestimated Obama because they didn't think as many black men would come out to vote for him as they did in 2012. And so if you just miss by a hair both ways on your turnout model, it can be a disaster. And so a lot of times, especially when we talked about the low propensity and no propensity voters, a lot of these pollsters were screening them out. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. Why was Atlas so accurate? They believed those voters. Look at their poll in Michigan. It was dead
on.
ass
1.5, right?
Why?
Yep.
Right. And actually, they got the exact percentage right, too. Yep. Why? They believed those voters who had never voted before saying, we're coming out for Trump. Whereas all these other pollsters were saying, no, they're not going to vote. They've never voted before. They haven't voted since Kerry 04. They're not voting. Which is, you get that.
Yeah.
You're going to screen them out in a likely voter. And Atlas, if they keep doing that, will eventually get burned. But they came out for Trump this time and made Atlas look like a genius.
Well, it's interesting. We talked about this on the show before. The Obama coalition, the Trump coalition, they get their voters out. These two men as politicians in our era, they have that special connection with their voters, and they were both able to keep their coalitions together, and most importantly, they got their people to the polls, unlike other politicians we've seen in the last 20-25 years.
Yeah, as we know, and as I've said before, Trump is a one-man turnout machine. And so the minute that he embraced early voting and he was getting people to the polls early, that can be worth a point. Whereas in past, people are standing in long lines. All of a sudden, it's 8 o'clock, polls close. All these people can't vote. Guess what? Now all those people have already voted. That's worth a point. And the early voting looks even worse for Democrats than in years past because you've got people, Republicans voting early. So Trump, once he embraced early voting, he was already going to get his election day vote out. He always does. And so once he did that, it was a game changer. And you've seen it every time he's on the ballot, he increases his vote total.
So let me ask you. I'll ask you for both parties. We'll stay on the GOP for a second. Where do you see them going from here? And I mean this from the standpoint of there were a bunch of states that you and I have talked about
Mhm.
that were way closer than they were in 2020, or not as close as they were in 2016, but some of them were. So I'm looking at four. I'm looking at Virginia, New Mexico, New Hampshire, and New Jersey. Do you think the RNC or whoever the powers that be within the Republican Party are going to spend time now and invest in those states going forward to make some inroads in terms of registration and trying to put those states back in play? Nevada, finally, Republicans finally got it after 20 plus years. So it can be done. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you'll get your first go at Virginia, New Jersey next year with the governor's races. And the ground activists like Pressler and all those guys will be working hard. Um, the problem is that as the establishment GOP, you say, um, they are not listening. They are already talking about California's in play because Trump got 40% and only lost by 17. They somehow think that California can now be the next state without any conversation about New Jersey or Virginia. And that's because the establishment GOP is headquartered essentially and ideologically in California, right? That's where their funds come from. That's where everything is, right? And so they think, oh, we can win California again. We only lost by 17 this time. I'm not kidding. I've seen this all Saturday long on Fox News. That's all they were talking about. California's in play. It's stupid. And you see this again with the Senate Majority Leader race, and that 42 senators are either supporting Thune or Cornyn, and only 11 with Rick Scott. Now, if you break it down by three, Scott really only needs a third from each. But then the problem would be, would Cornyn
Mm-hmm.
throw his support behind Thune? But my point being is that just because Trump got 50% and has a mandate doesn't seem that the powers that be has gotten the message.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head that we will see in those off year elections in 2025. Will the GOP be able to make some inroads, particularly in New Jersey? I think Virginia, by virtue of the fact that you have a sitting Republican governor there,
Mhm.
Youngkin will assist with whatever the GOP needs in terms of get out the vote efforts, and will throw his weight likely behind whatever candidate is nominated by the Republicans, since Virginia has that one term rule. Let me just ask you though about New Hampshire. New Hampshire traditionally was a swing state. It has not gone Republican since 2000 when George Bush won it. Is that something? It's been closer. It was super close in 2016, wasn't close in 2020, and was closer in 2024, but Harris still won it by a healthy-ish margin. Do you think that's something we'll see the GOP focus on in years to come?
The problem with New Hampshire is that there's so many Massachusetts
Mm.
retirees that now live in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is not a swing state. It swings during swing elections. This was a swing election. The problem was New Hampshire went for Biden in 2020 by 7.5. So that's a large swing that would have to happen. It swung by about 5 points. It went for Harris by about 2.5, something like that. So it's pretty close. But the problem was it had to swing 7.75 points to go for Trump by a small margin, and so it swung hard. But it just was never there for Trump. It was just too much of a lift, and again, too many Massachusetts
Mm.
retirees. No matter how much I love Boston, I don't think they're helping us.
Well, all right. So on the other side, where do the Democrats go from here? Now, we don't have to get into policy, but as much as you might want to, but in terms of electorally, where do the Democrats go from here? Because they lost every single swing state. Now, the one thing I think that they could take from this is they had some Senate candidates that were able to go past whatever Trump surge there was in that state. So in Nevada, Jackie Rosen won her race. Tammy Baldwin won her race in Wisconsin. So it seems like some of their individual candidates are still able to connect with their voters, and they're able to do well in some of their more local elections. In Michigan, I know they did well in the Supreme Court election. A couple of other states, they did well in the legislature, such as North Carolina. So maybe it's a ground up for the Democrats, starting at the local, the local and the state levels. Where do you see and where do you think they go from here on an electoral basis?
Um. So first of all, the Democrats are not going to learn any lesson from this. They won't. They have not suffered enough. They need to lose more before they realize they need to come back to the center right, center left area, back where Bill Clinton was. Right. You look at Dearborn, Michigan, which went 88 points for Biden in 2020 and is now Trump plus 7. They voted for Jill Stein.
40,
Now,
something like 40 something percent in Dearborn.
yes, yes. And so the question would be in 2028, and I think it's an obvious answer. Are they going to vote for Stein again in 2028? They're more likely to be dissatisfied by the Republican administration, right? It was a vote of protest, and they're unlikely to be satisfied with the Trump administration, and they'll likely vote Democrat. And that state, which was only Trump plus 1.5, could easily be razor thin to even Dem lean. Look, Wisconsin, it voted to the left for the first time, the left of Michigan for the first time in I don't know how long. And that might be the sign that the blue wall is starting to break, or the Rust Belt, because it's not a blue wall anymore. It's just a wall. Okay, because both parties have now won it. The wall part is that they vote
Right. Well,
together.
that's the most
Okay?
interesting part, right? So
But
now since
but that's what I'm talking
yeah,
about. The fact that Wisconsin voted to the left of Michigan might be a sign that Wisconsin might be breaking off. So you look at 2028 and you look at Michigan and you look at Wisconsin and the signs and the undercurrents of the election results with Stein, it might be more difficult for, say, a Vance to repeat what Trump did. One, because Trump is such a natural turnout machine, whereas Vance, as good as he is on policy, it comes off as so much of a polished politician. Even Vivek Ramaswamy might garner more enthusiasm because he's so off the cuff and so authentic. And there's nothing wrong with JD Vance. He's just, when you talk sophisticated like that, people who work in factories don't relate to you. That's just, I'm sorry. That's true. Okay.
well, I
So
mean, you look at whether it's Obama, Trump, right? Even Bush, relatability was one of the biggest factors
yeah.
for all three of them to be able to get elected.
Yeah, and listen, like another warning sign, and like, listen, JD Vance is a great candidate. I'm not here, and I know I've taken some heat on X because I said that he'd be a sitting VP, and they usually don't do well. Okay, unless Trump is popular, he's going to be behind the gun as the nominee. But at the same time, um, when all the people like the Megyn Kellys and all these Washington consultants and pundits who have an issue with Trump's style, all of a sudden love JD Vance's debate, that's a warning sign for the type of candidate we're going forward. Again, JD Vance would be a great nominee, but he would not be as strong as Trump. And that's a problem going forward for the Republicans. Going forward for the Democrats, obviously, it's going to be Josh Shapiro, their savior, their messiah. And listen, JD Vance, Josh Shapiro, that's gonna be a fight for the ages. That might be a 270, 268 battle.
Well, we know a lot can happen in the next 4 years, but I think Josh Shapiro is probably high on the list of the bench for
They're
the
already
Democratic
asking
Party.
him to run. They're already asking him to run.
And by that point, look, he's a very popular governor in the most important swing state in the country. So, he's got a 60-something% approval rating.
And another thing is, in 2022, 15% of 2020 Trump voters voted for Shapiro in 2022.
Right.
So he's got appeal among Trump
So
voters.
maybe for him there was a good calculation to not join the ticket in such a rushed manner in a rushed race, and to keep himself on the sidelines just in case the Harris team lost, so we wouldn't have that loss connected to him, and he'd be available for 2028 to do his own thing.
He didn't want her to win, and neither did Gretchen Whitmer. Okay. The only person
is that the ticket that you're predicting in 2028?
No,
Shapiro,
but I do think
Whitmer?
Shapiro. I mean, it's possible, but I think Shapiro is going to be atop of the ticket. There's no way he isn't, unless like an Ocasio-Cortez runs his. But I mean, I don't think she gains as much traction as people think. I think Shapiro is really that talented.
We'll leave it here on David Chapman's giddiness. David and I think, are going to have some baseball pods during the winter meetings. What are you looking forward to most for the winter meetings? I'm looking forward to the Mets signing Soto, because he basically said he's not coming back to the Yankees.
That came out today that he was not coming back to the Yankees. There was also a prediction that he was going to go to Toronto. I don't know who's writing that crap.
That happening.
But I think it's going to be what it was for Shohei last year. He's going to Toronto. He's going here. He's going there. When he was never going to any of those places, he was always going to LA. And it's going to be this media frenzy for clickbait and viewership. And I'm just glad the Cubs are keeping Bellinger. He did not opt out of his deal, and so if they're now talking about Max Fried. He's a free agent.
Well,
so that'd be a good pickup.
We know that Soto is right and good for the big stage, so I don't think he'll have any problems playing in another New York uniform, or in LA, or another big market, maybe Chicago. Maybe the White Sox. No, I'm kidding.
The Ricketts did say they will be checking in on him. The Cubs were willing to give Shohei Ohtani $600 million, which was only $100 million less than Ohtani ended up getting. The real problem with Ohtani and the Cubs is that Ohtani didn't want to leave LA.
Right.
And so, but I mean, if they're willing to give Ohtani $600 million, I mean, they'll definitely be within the ballpark for Soto.
All right, we'll leave it at that. David, we'll have you back on for some history, some baseball. Enjoy your giddiness, and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome.
All right, and everybody, remember, you can check out David. David, give us your shameless self-promotion, as always.
Yeah, I run my podcast every Saturday night at midnight, which is technically Sunday morning, but I run about an hour. Right now, I'm covering Trump transitions. It's kind of slow right now, but I can always fill it up with some crazy sayings and good videos. So come check me out. And of course, you guys probably already know where to follow me on X. So.
All right. So the Chapman Show on YouTube, and at David Chapman 141 on X. We'll see you soon. Thanks, David.
Mm-hmm.